removing the eyeball or cutting the optic nerve, that's the same thing. So take a minute, discuss amongst yourselves, what would be worse, cutting the optic nerve or cutting the optic tract? What would have a worse deficit?
I think optic tract. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm leaning towards too, but that's just because I feel like taking out an eyeball is a serious handicap.
I feel like when you cut the optic tract, you lose vision in both eyes.
For both parts, right?
Mm-hmm. But when you cut the optic nerve, you can't see out of the left eye or the right eye, depending on which nerve you cut.
True.
That was my background.
Okay. So who would say cut the optic nerve? That would be the lesser of the deficit. So if somebody came up to you and said, I'm gonna cut your optic nerve or cut your optic tract, which one would you say, go ahead and do? Now, neither one we really want, but which would be less of a deficit? Who says optic nerve? Who says optic tract? You would ask them to cut the optic nerve, because by cutting the optic nerve, you still have, it's the same thing as covering up an eyeball. You can still see most of your visual field. That's the same thing as cutting the optic nerve or taking out an eyeball if you cover it up. The only thing you really lost is depth perception. But if you cut the optic tract, you lose half of your visual field. So if I would cut the left optic tract, everything on the right half of my visual field, all of this would be gone. Everything would be gone over here. If I cut it over here, everything would be gone over here. Now, I say that, but there's one little extra piece. The optic chiasma here. What happens if that gets knocked out? Most of your visual field is making it back, except for a little bit of peripheral vision. Somebody has a pituitary gland tumor. That pituitary gland is sitting in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And it's surrounded completely by bone, anteriorly, posteriorly, laterally, inferiorly. The only direction that pituitary gland tumor can grow is superiorly. And what sits superiorly is that optic chiasma. So very often, a person with a pituitary gland tumor comes into the doctor's office and says, I feel like I'm walking through a tunnel. I've lost my peripheral vision. I feel like I'm walking through a tunnel. Because this area right here has been knocked out because of that tumor coming up and hitting on that. Why is that? Well, what we have crossing over there is the medial aspect of each eye. That medial aspect of each eye is getting a little bit of something else that the lateral portions are not. If something's sitting out here on my right half of my visual field, sitting way over here, so let's say Farmer Bob's cat is sitting right here. That cat information is coming into the nasal aspect of this eye, but it can't make it all the way over to the left eye. Why can't it? What's in the way?
Your nose?
Your nose. And so that cat sitting right here can make it into the nasal aspect of this eye, but it can't make it across the nose to the temporal aspect of the contralateral eye. And so, although most of the visual field can make it back from the temporal aspect, what is lost here is peripheral vision, because periphery is only coming into the nasal aspect of each eye. Anybody have any questions on this? So we have our right half of our visual field now in the left optic tract, the left half of our visual field in the right optic tract. We're going to carry this information back now. And we're going to see that most of the axons in the occipital, on the optic tracts, will synapse neurons in the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus. Remember, most of your sensation is going to head over to the thalamus for a nice synapse or two before it's going to head back to the area where you become consciously aware of it. Okay? So, and then we're going to see that that information is going to continue on through the internal capsule and form the optic radiation in the cerebral white matter. The axons finally arrive at the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobes, where you become visually aware or sensing the vision. Now, if we think about this area, what cerebral artery is going to serve this area? posterior cerebral arteries. So if I have a problem with my left posterior cerebral artery, which half of my visual field could be impacted? You're right, it's contralateral. It's contralateral. So problem with the posterior cerebral could lead to a problem with vision. And if it's the left posterior cerebral, it would be a deficit in the right half of the visual field. And vice versa. So play with this pathway, think about the crossing overs, think about the deficits that you would lose if you would cut the optic tracts, if you cut the optic tract, if you cut the optic chiasma, and if you cut the optic nerve, which would be the same thing as removing an eyeball. Think about the deficits that would be involved at those locations. Anybody have any questions? Let's go on to our last two special senses, that are hearing and equilibrium. We're going to see that our receptors here are mechanoreceptors. And so remember, mechanoreceptors have to be physically deformed to open and close the channels that are involved with transduction. And those mechanoreceptors, along with other cells, are going to make up the complex receptors. The complex receptor for hearing is called the spiral organ, or the spiral organ of Corti, or just the organ of Corti, and it's located in the cochlea, which is within the inner ear. For equilibrium, the complex receptor, where those mechanoreceptors are for equilibrium, as well as other cell populations, are located in the vestibular apparatus, which is located in the vestibule and the semicircular canals, which is also located in the inner ear. When we look at the ear, we're going to see that the ear has three major areas. We have the outer or external ear, and the outer or external ear is involved with hearing only. So the outer or external ear is involved with hearing only. We have the middle ear or tympanic cavity. That middle ear or tympanic cavity is involved with hearing only as well. And then we have the inner ear, also known as the internal ear or labyrinth, and this third part is going to be associated with both hearing and equilibrium. Remember, these spaces, these cavities, these different areas, the outer and the middle and the inner ear, are on both sides of the body. So they're going to be on the right side as well as on the left, so they're paired spaces. And we're going to start first with the external ear. And the external ear has two parts associated with it. It's going to have the auricle, also known as the pinna, and it's going to have the external auditory canal. Now, the auricle or the pinna is a shell-shaped projection of elastic cartilage with skin on the top surrounding the opening for the external auditory canal. So this shell-shaped projection of elastic cartilage with skin over top, and it's going to be surrounding the opening into the external auditory canal. What the auricle or the pinna is going to do for you is going to direct sound waves, collect and direct sound waves towards that external auditory canal. That's why if you want to hear somebody further away, what do you usually do? You increase the size of your pinna so that you can collect more sound waves that direct them towards that external auditory canal. Now, the external auditory canal extends from the auricle to the tympanic membrane. So it's going to extend from the auricle all the way down to the tympanic membrane. And that tympanic membrane is sitting between the external or outer ear and the middle ear. The external auditory canal is going to be made up of cartilage, as well as the bony canal through the temporal bone known as the external acoustic meatus. So the first portion of it here, maybe the first 1/3 of it, is going to be cartilage, but then when you get further in, this is going to be your external acoustic meatus here. It is also lined with skin, and it's gonna have modified sweat glands there called ceruminous glands. Ceruminous, ceruminous glands. And they secrete a waxy substance called cerumen, which is earwax, which are gonna trap foreign bodies and also repels insects. Yep.
What kind of cartilage is it lined with? The external auditory natives?
I have actually been trying to figure that out. I've seen some books call it elastic, I've seen other books call it hyaline.
Okay.
So just realize it's just cartilage.
Okay.
Yeah, this one we definitely know is elastic. This portion here is either hyaline or elastic. I've seen different books say different things.
Okay.
Yeah. At the end of the external auditory canal is gonna be that tympanic membrane that I mentioned. That's the boundary between the outer and the middle ear cavities. Sound waves are traveling down the external auditory canal and are gonna cause the eardrum to vibrate. And the eardrum is gonna transfer those sound waves to the bones of the middle ear. We're gonna talk about the middle ear now. So the middle ear cavity, tympanic cavity, whatever you wanna call it, is an air-filled cavity within the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So this is within that hard portion, that petrous portion of the temporal bone. It's air-filled. And if we look at it, we're gonna see that on the medial wall, there's two windows with coverings over them. We have the oval window, also known as the vestibular window, and the round window, also known as the cochlear window. We're also going to see the opening for the pharyngotympanic auditory or eustachian tube. And that's along the anterior wall. And we also see three bones that are going to come across the middle ear. That's going to be the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Let's look at these structures. So what they've done here is taken this area, blown it up so you can see it. We're looking at this area here. And the first thing you can see is this passageway here, which is your pharyngotympanic tube, auditory tube. You may also have heard eustachian tube, but trying to get away from using the term eustachian. I like pharyngotympanic because it tells me exactly what it's doing. It's going to be going from the tympanic cavity, so the middle ear cavity, to the nasopharynx, And that's important because for the tympanic membrane to vibrate freely, we have to have the same atmospheric pressure on both sides. So if you think about going up in an airplane, the pressure around you, your atmospheric pressure around you is changing. At the same time, the air on the inside is stayed the same. So what do you usually do? You swallow, because you're trying to open up that pharyngotympanic tube so that air can equalize on the opposite side. And a lot of times if you've been sick, that's caused swelling in the throat, and maybe this tube hasn't been able to open and equalize pressure, and so things sound a little bit muffled because that tympanic membrane can't vibrate as freely as it normally has. Unfortunately, if you also think about this pathway, it's going from the nasopharynx to the middle ear, and unfortunately it's also a good pathway for infections to travel. As we know, we have the auditory audicles crossing the middle ear cavity. These are the smallest bones in the body, and they articulate with one another. We're going to have the malleus or the hammer. We're then going to have the incus, also known as the anvil, and then the stapes. Make sure you know both terms, but try to use the more anatomically correct term, or formal term. These bones articulate with one another. They're going to articulate with one another. And as small as those bones are, they are articulating with one another at synovial joints. And they're diarthrotic joints then. The malleus is going to have its handle. The malleus is going to have its handle embedded in the tympanic membrane. The malleus then articulates with the incus, and the incus articulates with the stapes. And then the stapes has a foot plate, it's called a foot plate, which is sitting in this oval window. One of those two windows we talked about. More superiorly is the oval window, and that's what the foot plate of the stapes is sitting in. And below that's the round window on that wall. So as a sound wave comes down the external auditory canal, it's going to cause the tympanic membrane to begin to vibrate. Well, the receptors that we need that information get to are all the way in the inner ear. So we need to send that information towards the inner ear. It's going to be sent from the malleus to the incus to the stapes, and then the stapes foot plate is going to start hitting on that oval window. Sitting behind that oval window is the inner ear. And that inner ear has fluid in it. And it's going to start waves in that fluid. And those waves are going to go through the cochlea, which contains the spiral organ of Corti. And so those waves are going to be able to activate our mechanoreceptors in the spiral organ of Corti, do the transduction, and send that information back to the brain. But if you remember, liquid is non-compressible. If you push on it somewhere, it's got to pop out somewhere else. And that's the point of the round window. As the stapes is hitting on that oval window, that wave is going through here, and it's causing the round window to pop out a little bit with that same sort of vibration pattern. So it's sort of like a pressure release valve.
Going back, could you explain one more time why, where the eustachian tube leads to make it a common source of infection?
It's going to be the nasopharynx, so the beginning, the very top portion or superior portion of the pharynx.
Okay.
Yeah, nasopharynx portion. Yeah. Anybody have any questions on anything in the middle ear? Okay. So our sound waves came down the external auditory canal, caused the tympanic membrane to begin to vibrate. Those vibrations are sent along the malleus, the incus, to the stapes, and to the oval window. And that brings up our third area, which is going to be the inner ear. And when you look at the inner ear, that inner ear is going to have some bony regions associated with it. The inner ear itself is also known as the labyrinth, which means maze, because of its complicated shape. It also lies within the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So this is also in the petrous portion of the temporal bone. And although the middle ear cavity was filled with air, as I mentioned, that inner ear area is filled with fluid. So it's fluid filled. It's a fluid-filled cavity. There are different parts or bony regions within the inner ear. We're going to have the cochlea, the vestibule, and the semicircular canal. So there are 3 of them. They're only showing you 2 in this particular image. The cochlea, which you see here, is going to be a spiral, conical, bony chamber that contains the spiral organ of Corti, which is the complex receptor for hearing. So we know that our sound waves are coming across the auditory audicles to the oval window, and those vibrations start going through the fluid, and at some point along that pathway, it's going to cause the vibrations to cross through that spiral organ of Corti. In that spiral organ of Corti are our mechanoreceptors called hair cells. And those hair cells do the transduction for us. They're physically deformed. When they're physically deformed, different channels open and close, which is going to cause an electrical, our electrical event to begin. So if we're going to have that electrical event begin, we somehow have to get that information back to the brain. And so you can see coming into the cochlea, here's the cochlear nerve. That cochlear nerve is a division or a branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 8. Then we have the vestibules, the vestibule and the semicircular canals. In the vestibule and the semicircular canals is going to be the vestibular apparatus, which is going to be different areas of cells that are going to have mechanoreceptors that are for equilibrium. When you move at a faster rate, at a slower rate, when you go up, when you go down, and you speed up, when you slow down, this fluid in these compartments is going to change their speed. And so it's going to change how these cells, these mechanoreceptors, are bent. When those mechanoreceptors are bent certain ways, they then are going to change the information they're sending back to the brain. So attached to the vestibule and attached to the semicircular canals is the vestibular nerve of the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 8. So the question is, where does this information go? Well, there isn't a cortical area, a primary cortical area for equilibrium. You become aware of equilibrium issues because of sort of the side effects, and a lot of that information is going to things like the cerebellum and other areas of the brain. You become aware of side effects of it. So there's no cortical area for the vestibular nerve to go to. But there is a cortical area that you become consciously aware of hearing. Where is that? Well, we've talked about it a little bit already. Here is a cross-section through the cochlea. And so you can see one of these tunnels, one of these cross-sections of one of the tunnels in that 2.5 spiral cochlea. The vibrations are going through the fluid, and at some point along the pathway, it's going to cut through and it's going to activate these hair cells. These hair cells are going to be having a synapse with the beginning of the pathway back to the brain. Here's your cochlear division of your vestibular cochlear nerve. That information is going to come into the medulla for a nice synapse, cross sides. It's going to come up, and look where it goes first before it gets to the primary cortical area. It actually hits the inferior colliculus first. So you have that startle reflex where you turn your head to a sound before you're even consciously aware of it. So you go up to the nice thalamus for a nice synapse or two, because remember, almost all of our sensory things are going to go to the thalamus first, and then we're going to go to the primary auditory cortex and the temporal lobes. What artery is going to serve this area? Middle cerebral. Middle cerebral. Okay, so if you have a problem with middle cerebral, you may have a problem with hearing. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying. What did you mean by there is no cortical area for hearing?
So if you think about it, if you think about all the other special areas, if you think about taste, smell, hearing, and vision, there's a cortical area that the information goes to where you become consciously aware of it. There is no area in the brain that information goes directly to for equilibrium, that you become consciously aware of it. So we don't see there's a primary cortical area for equilibrium. You only become aware of equilibrium if there's a problem and other things start to happen. So you may feel nausea, you sort of feel the side effects of it. So you may feel nausea, for example, for going to the amusement park, and your equilibrium is that information is going to the cerebellum, it's going to the primary motor cortex, it's going to a bunch of other areas, and so there's nowhere where you consciously perceive it, you just feel the side effects of it.
So when we're talking about the primary auditory cortex, we're not talking about directly equilibrium, we're just talking about hearing.
We're just hearing, it's just hearing.
Okay.
Just hearing. It's sort of like the same idea that we have sensory receptors for our viscera. We don't, like if there is an issue with the stomach, we don't feel directly we don't see the homunculus with a stomach area on it. We don't feel that directly, but indirectly we may feel discomfort, that kind of idea. So other areas of the brain will actually cause discomfort, nausea, things along those lines.
And one more question.
Yeah.
When we're talking about equilibrium, are we referring to balance, rotational acceleration? What is it?
Exactly, all
All
that.
of those things?
All those
Okay.
things. Any other questions? So the next couple slides just kind of are a nice summary slide showing you the external ear with the auricle, or the pinna, the external auditory canal, the tympanic membrane, which is actually between the external ear and the middle ear. Here's the middle ear and its components, the auditory oscillus, the auditory tube, and then the inner ear. Any questions? Would you guys take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and start talking